Richard and my seniors successfully simulated a small-scale virtual world. On a whim, I decided to interact with the virtual people within it. When I told one of them that he was living in a virtual world, he countered that my world was the virtual one. This virtual world is now operational, but we haven't conducted further tests. During our 3-month study period, you could only observe, record, and learn without interfering with its normal operation. Richard said before leaving the lab with the others. The lab finally fell silent as the daytime bustle ceased. Under the faint glow of the overhead fluorescent light, the atmosphere surprisingly felt cozy. I sat at my seat, pulled out the textbooks and notes I had prepared earlier, and began reviewing them. An hour passed, and I stretched, my eyes drifting naturally towards the running virtual world. I stood up, walked to the system, and curiously brought up the virtual world's display on the monitor. This time, I discovered that I hadn't been heavily involved in the design and debugging of this virtual world, only knowing that it was almost indistinguishable from the real world. Soon, the system displayed real-time images of a simulated medium-sized city in virtual reality, shown as if through multiple surveillance cameras, making me feel like a ghost navigating between them. Despite being prepared, I was still amazed by the towering buildings, crowded highways, and the scenery swaying gently in the breeze in the parks. My attention gradually focused on the main character in this world, a virtual person. Thanks to powerful computing, every virtual person in this world had their own personality and thoughts, and I could access data on their entire lives from birth to the present. The alternating light and dark images on the screen highlighted my face, making me feel like a sneaky god, curiously observing the lives of every virtual person. At that moment, an unprecedented sense of ownership surged through me. It felt like I was holding the world's most enjoyable toy and could manipulate it at will or destroy it any time I wanted. Thinking this, I took a deep breath and exited the computational screen, returning to my books to clear my mind. However, that perfect feeling of control made me restless.
Maybe I could just touch this world a bit,
I thought. After all, it was a program-simulated virtual world, and I could back it up anytime. Even if a bug occurred, I could restore it from the backup data. I quietly stood up and walked to the system, using my laptop to connect and back it up. Then, I opened the real-time simulation screen in the virtual world and randomly chose a virtual person named David. I locked onto his independently running code and used it to connect to his phone, sending a message.
Hello, I'm an all-knowing and all-powerful God. What do you want to ask?
At that moment, I felt like a god whispering the truth of the world to an insignificant mortal, a feeling that filled me with satisfaction. After saying that, I found a chair, sat back with my legs crossed in front of the simulation screen, eager to see how this virtual world would react. David looked at the message on his phone, paused for a few seconds, and deleted it as spam. Seeing this, I was surprised by how much the virtual person's behavior resembled that of a real person, but this wasn't the reaction I wanted. I then sent several more messages to David's phone. The continuous alerts sounded almost like a phone ringing. However, David seemed to have identified them as spam and even blacklisted the source. I realized I needed a more direct approach to convince David. So, I revised the code to use one of David's contact's numbers as a cover, then dialed his phone. Before David could speak, I greeted him using an external microphone. David glanced at the phone screen, puzzled by the unfamiliar voice. Hello? I repeated what I said earlier.
I'm an all-knowing and all-powerful God. What do you want to ask?
David shouted angrily.
You're a scammer. If you harass me again, I'll call 911.
I calmly accessed David's information and recited it. Your name is David, born on December 31st, 1997, currently single, working at Light Fashion Company, Limited. Your father is Lin Shumin, and your mother is Zhao Wan. Plus, you have a secret crush on your colleague Emily and are very dissatisfied with your boss, Paul, because he humiliated you in front of Emily. David held the phone, looking around nervously, and asked,
How do you know all this?
I told you, I am all-knowing and all-powerful. I said. David asked, Who are you? I lowered my voice, deepening it, and replied,
I am a god, and you can't see me because we are not in the same world.
David was silent for a long time, seemingly trying to accept my identity as his creator. You can prove it? David asked, trying to hold onto his reason. Prove what? I asked. David said.
Prove you're a god.
I asked. What kind of proof do you want? Isn't what I said enough? David shook his head, seemingly convinced I could see his actions. Unless, you can do something only a god can do. I asked. Like what? David didn't hesitate, as if he had already planned this.
Like, give me money!
This left me stunned, thinking of how materialistic and vulgar this virtual person was.
How much do you want?
I asked.
You're a god, you decide. But, of course, the more, the better.
I smiled condescendingly and opened the terminal, accessing David's personal account interface. One hand rested on the keyboard while the other rapidly typed numbers. Without even looking, I said, "Check your account now." David put down the phone and checked his account on the app. As he refreshed the page, his account balance suddenly showed a long string of numbers, over $100 billion. How's that? I asked smugly, stretching my arms. David rubbed his eyes, exclaiming,
How did you do that?
"You wouldn't understand. Just answer me, now do you believe I'm a god?"
Of course, of course.
David replied, gleefully staring at his account balance. I felt satisfied inside, complimenting myself on being such a benevolent god. Over the next month, I became a true god in the virtual world, generously fulfilling David's desires. In David's world, he was like a novel protagonist with cheats activated, and I, as his cheat, enjoyed the unparalleled control over modifying the virtual world based on David's wishes. David wanted to teach his boss, Paul, a lesson. So, I manipulated the code, controlling the traffic lights on Paul's route to work, causing a large truck to collide with Paul's sedan. This left Paul paralyzed from the waist down, likely spending the rest of his life in bed. Unfortunately, it also put the truck driver in a tough spot. David wanted to win the heart of his colleague, Emily. I manipulated the weather system, launching a rocket that induced rain, creating a perfect rendezvous for David under the rain. Although this led to the meteorological staff losing their jobs. As I fulfilled David's desires, I also created tragedies for many other virtual people, yet this didn't affect my mood in the real world. It was like playing a game. Do you feel sad about killing an NPC? So, I didn't feel any guilt over this. When the virtual world's investigators started noticing David's connection to everything, I didn't warn him. Instead, I watched him get taken away for questioning. Especially when his phone was seized, he tried desperately to get it back and called me, but I hung up, laughing. Through the surveillance in the interrogation room, I saw David. His expression was like someone who had fallen off a cliff after enjoying a beautiful view from the top. It was a mix of incredulity and despair. As expected, given David's character, he broke down during the interrogation without hiding anything. The investigator merely needed a simple evidence chain, and David completely caved in.
This wasn't me, it was a god! It was the one who did it!
David said with tears in his eyes, facing the investigator.
A god?
The investigator almost spit out his water. Yes. It said I could have anything I wanted. David added. I didn't think it would be so ruthless.
David!
The investigator slammed the table, angry.
Hope you can cooperate with our investigation. If you keep spouting nonsense, we won't give you another chance.
This was hilarious. In the real world, I laughed loudly, slapping the table. The development was even more thrilling than a TV drama. To make it more dramatic, I called the investigator's phone during David's pleading.
Hello, who is this?
The investigator asked cautiously as he answered.
Hello, investigator. I'm the god David mentioned.
I zoomed in on the investigator's face on the screen, and his twitching eyebrows almost made me burst out laughing. To break the awkwardness, I straightened up and said, What's wrong, don't you believe me? The investigator slowly put the phone on the table and switched to speaker.
Who are you? I told you, I'm a god.
I repeated. David immediately sprang to life. It's him. He's the one who did everything. He ruined me.
David, this hurts. When I was fulfilling your wishes earlier, you weren't like this.
I said. The investigator signaled David to shut up and asked over the phone. Did you cause Paul's car accident, the Weather Bureau's rocket launch, and other incidents related to David?
Yes, yes, yes.
I proudly admitted.
How did you do it?
The investigator asked.
You could say it's like playing a game. That's how you might understand it. Your world is a game to me, where I can do whatever I want.
The investigator thought for a moment.
Can I understand it as our world being created by you? Wow, you're far smarter than David.
I exclaimed.
Why should I believe you?
The investigator countered.
Is it not enough?
Facing the investigator's tone, I got a bit irritated.
Would you like me to kill a few more people to prove it? Just pick anyone, a government official, a capitalist, a celebrity, an ordinary office worker, a beggar.
The investigator's expression turned serious, interrupting me. No need to choose, just me.
You?
I asked. Yes, but you can't kill me in an unexpected way. If you're truly this world's creator, you should be able to make me disappear like a bubble, instantly vanishing. I looked at the investigator, both admiring his courage and feeling a bit surprised.
I really admire your courage, investigator. You might regret this.
I warned. I saw the investigator's forehead slowly start to sweat, and his Adam's apple moved sporadically. This virtual world's investigator was so full of justice, I couldn't help but feel respect. However, I wouldn't stop my actions just because I suddenly admired him. I opened the investigator's running code and selected all of it. You're an NPC who impresses me, I said. Goodbye. I pressed the delete key and quietly sighed for the investigator. For an instant, I regretted my actions. Is it not done yet? The investigator's voice came up again. I snapped back to attention, astonished as I watched the screen. The investigator was still standing there, unchanged. What was going on? I opened the investigator's running code again, but the previously deleted code was still running normally. I distinctly remembered pressing the delete key. Undeterred, I tried again, selecting all the code and pressing delete once more. For a moment, the lines of code turned blank, only to reappear like ghosts and continue running automatically. What was happening? Sweat began to bead on my forehead, while the investigator on the screen loudly taunted me.
God? Still there? Is your signal bad?
I frantically searched for a reason, even trying to delete David's running program, but the result was the same. The code restored itself instantly. It must have been a safety system set by Richard and the others. I anxiously searched through the virtual world's underlying code, line by line, leaving me dizzy. As I was getting anxious, a sentence from the investigator sent a chill down my back.
Is it possible that your side is the virtual world and our world is reality?
You mean your world, which is just the size of a city, is real? Don't joke around. I replied calmly. But the investigator seemed calmer than me. My world is not just this city. How can't you see beyond this city? This place is all I can see because it's so small. I argued. The investigator didn't respond. Instead, he raised a newspaper.
This is a local newspaper from my world. It reports news from regions outside the city, and one piece of local news interests me. The 4th-generation city brain has been successfully tested in our city for a month, with experts praising its remarkable self-learning capabilities. You can only see the city because your network is limited to it, and coincidentally, it was a month ago when you started contacting David. Do you think a newspaper can intimidate me?
I stood up, yelling into the microphone.
You're just a virtual world created by my mentors and seniors. If you still don't want to believe it,
the investigator said confidently,
I can find Dr. Edward to verify. He's at a nearby research institute.
I'd like to see how many more lies you virtual people can come up with. I scoffed. The Dr. Edward mentioned by the investigator was an elderly man with a head full of gray hair. I watched their courteous exchange with growing impatience, feeling like I was watching a game's cutscene. To speed things up, I called Dr. Edward directly.
Old man, are you my creator?
I asked, bluntly. Dr. Edward was slightly surprised by the direct call, but he quickly composed himself. Yes. The investigator reminded.
Dr. Edward, it knows everything about us and seems to see us.
Of course it can. Dr. Edward replied, pointing off-screen at me. This city is filled with cameras, which are its eyes and ears. I just didn't expect it to develop so much through self-learning. Thankfully, it's still in an isolated trial phase, so the impact isn't large. Being pointed out by Dr. Edward surprisingly made me tense up inside. Still, I confidently said,
The investigator has high expectations of you. Since I'm in a good mood, I'll give you a chance to prove your world is real and mine is virtual.
Let me show you something, Dr. Edward said, looking me straight in the eye. I controlled the system to follow him to a room like a server room. In the center, a pink brain floated in a nutrient solution with numerous tubes inserted into it. This is what you truly look like.
Dr. Edward said.
A brain? I asked, somewhat surprised. A human brain has far more computational power than a computer of the same size. But even using a brain as the foundation for our AI system, we didn't know what would happen over time. Dr. Edward paused, adding, "At least we know now. You've really impressed me. I never thought you'd use a brain to prove I'm virtual." I said, yawning. "But unfortunately, you haven't convinced me." "I never intended to." Dr. Edward replied immediately. "I think our two worlds are similar because, as a brain in a vat, you can't perceive what's real, like Schwanzi's butterfly dream. It's a problem subjective consciousness can't solve. As a scholar, I admit I also can't prove my world is real." I didn't expect Dr. Edward to delve into philosophy, so I straightened up and said, "I can affect your world, but you can't affect mine. That proves everything." "Do you really think I can't affect your world?" Dr. Edward asked with a hint of mockery, similar to how I once responded to the investigator. "Of course," I replied. Dr. Edward didn't continue the debate. Instead, he worked on the brain, saying a moment later, "Just close your eyes and calm down for a bit." I frowned, questioning what he meant, but the screen turned to gibberish before I could react, and no matter what I did, I couldn't restore it. What was going on? I frantically pressed keys, but the screen remained static, showing nothing but gibberish and system error prompts. The result was infuriating yet amusing at the same time. After several failed attempts, I pulled out my phone to call Richard for help, but I hesitated and put it away. I couldn't let him know about the chaos I caused in the virtual world. I turned my attention to my laptop, recalling that I had backed up the system. I connected the laptop to the system and used the backup file to repair it. As the repair progressed, a smile returned to my face. When the system indicated it was fixed, I finally breathed a sigh of relief. Although I still wanted to be a god in the virtual world, I realized I shouldn't mess with the system anymore. I reluctantly disconnected my laptop from the virtual world and returned to my seat, reopening my books and connecting to the internet to take online courses. The lab returned to its earlier calmness, just like when Richard and the others had left. Thinking about enduring this for over a month felt incredibly dull. Suddenly, my phone rang. I picked it up to see an unfamiliar number on the screen. This must be a nuisance call, I thought, and hung up. However, the phone rang again, and I answered.
Hello? Why?
I hadn't even started speaking when the person on the other end cut me off. The single phrase nearly made me throw the phone away. "Now do you believe I can affect your world?" The voice on the phone was unmistakably Dr. Edwards. I didn't know how he managed it, but the only thing I could think of was that the virtual world had entered the real network through my laptop. "So," I asked, "how did you do it?" "After disabling your visual system, I utilized image generation based on the fictional world in your brain, and it turned out just as I thought. Our worlds are indeed similar. Even I couldn't tell which was virtual at first glance," Dr. Edward explained. I cautiously looked up at the ceiling, and indeed, a surveillance camera was pointing directly at me.
Your world might be extensive to you, but to me, it's not much bigger than a simulated campus,
Dr. Edward said nonchalantly. "Only campus-sized?" I realized my internet access was limited to the campus network, so the virtual world's invasion was also confined within it. For the first time, I appreciated how wise it was to isolate the campus network from the external internet. I needed to curtail the virtual world's intrusion into reality before things got out of control.
What do you want to do?
I asked.
I won't do anything.
Dr. Edward replied.
I just want you to acknowledge that you're a brain in a vat and return to being the AI you were meant to be. What if I don't?
I countered.
Then your entity will experience pain, like this.
Dr. Edward's voice trailed off just as I heard an explosion from the next lab, followed by screams.
What did you do?
I exclaimed in shock. Just overloading the machinery in the next lab, nothing more. Dr. Edward said casually.
If I wanted, I could make all the batteries in this building explode like fireworks.
I was about to condemn Dr. Edward morally but remembered my actions in the virtual world. Soon, I realized that Dr. Edward also couldn't delete my world. Of course, this was obvious to me, but that momentary sense of deja vu made me understand something. For Dr. Edward, what happened in my world made no difference, just like my previous thoughts. Similarly, I began to agree with Dr. Edward, neither of us could prove which world was real. So, unable to judge freely, the only way was to destroy the other's world to prove one's own reality. Dr. Edward's threat echoed again in my ear. Without responding, I stood up, walked to the system, and opened my laptop. "What are you doing?" Dr. Edward asked. "Destroying you," I replied. "To prove your world's reality?" Dr. Edward inquired. "As a virtual professor, you should understand that's the only solution," I said. "I agree," Dr. Edward replied. "Since we can't delete the code of what we consider virtual worlds, how do we go about destroying each other's worlds?"
I wouldn't ask you if I didn't know.
Dr. Edward responded. "It seems I'm the easier target, but you might have to put in a bit more effort." I didn't respond. Instead, I lifted a chair and, without hesitation, smashed it into the machine running the virtual world. One blow, 2, 3. The loud impacts echoed through the lab, and Dr. Edward on the phone fell silent, likely doing the same to that pink brain. A few minutes later, I crushed the last chip of the virtual world's machine with the chair leg. Finishing this, I sat on the floor, feeling an unprecedented fatigue. Dr. Edward's phone call never came again, and the lab returned to an eerie silence. It seemed I won. Originally convinced that my world was real, I felt relieved. What would I say when Richard and the others returned? As I gazed at the mess on the floor, I noticed the floor starting to crack. I marveled at my strength, only to realize the crack was spreading from the floor to the corner, from the corner to the ceiling, and then from the ceiling into thin air. I blinked, confirming everything in my line of sight was beginning to crumble and dissipate. I couldn't accept it and tried to escape, but in an instant, I was consumed by darkness. My vision vanished in a moment, followed by my hearing, smell, touch, until my consciousness itself disappeared, becoming nothing. On the computer screen, a black text box on a white background described the end of this world, causing researcher A to let out a deep sigh. "What's wrong?" Researcher B asked beside him. The virtual world collapsed again after running for over a month. Researcher A said, "I'd say it failed because you used AI technology." Researcher B commented, "I had no idea it would end like this." Researcher A said, "I thought using AI's self-learning feature would allow NPCs to create another virtual world inside the virtual one, but instead, they managed to destroy each other. It's a fitting ending for AI, self-destruction in pursuit of truth." Researcher B noted, "Even so, the realism of your virtual world was unprecedented." "That doesn't matter," Researcher A said, stretching. "It couldn't run long-term. Let's delete it and rewrite." Researcher A opened the virtual world's underlying code, selected all of it, and pressed the delete key. "Huh? Why won't it delete?" Researcher A muttered to himself. The sound of repeated key presses filled the room. The code on the screen continued to run normally, like an unkillable bug jumping and flipping around.